All right, let's do this. Peanut, if you're staying in the room, no talking. Hello, and welcome to the PhotoWork podcast, the talky and touchy-feely version of my book, PhotoWork, 40 Photographers on Process and Practice. Hey, everyone, I'm Sasha Wolf, recording today from my big, comfy armchair in my bedroom in New York City. and I'm joined by that guy. You might have just heard him giggle. The one, the only, the sui generis, Michael, look it up, Michael Chauvin Dalton. Hello, Michael.
Hello. And you might sound a little different to our listeners today because while you are on your phone, I'm on my microphone, and we both have something in common. Why that's happening?
Yeah, we're both in COVID exile. My aunt and uncle, whose property I live on, both have COVID. And so I'm in the city, and your wife has COVID, and you are in your studio. You're hiding out in your studio.
Yeah, so I was able to quarantine or stay away from my wife in my studio with all my gear, whereas you had to abandon your gear. And by the way, my wife is okay, and your aunt and uncle are doing okay, right, with their COVID?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, they are. Yep. I wouldn't have left if they weren't, frankly.
Oh, yes.
I know. Just to be clear,
you didn't abandon.
I'm not a callous monster, right? No, they're doing all right. And once I knew they were, really okay, I decided, because neither you nor I have had it yet. And I decided to come into the city.
Yes.
But my recording equipment is all in the room that my uncle is quarantining in. So I just jumped in the car, threw Peanut in, and tossed her in, and drove down yonder. So so you're recording me over the phone. This is our it's an experiment. But anyway, we're both fine. Our loved ones are fine, and we have a great episode today with the process artist Meghann Riepenhoff, who has a new book out called Ice with Radius. It's magnificent.
Yes.
I really could not recommend it strongly enough. And it was so fun to talk to Meghann. I've been a big fan of her work for a long time. She's our first process artist that we've had on the show. And it was really fun to talk to someone who's making abstractions, working with, really chemistry in the paper.
Yeah.
And, well, anyway, what did you think?
Well, I was a science stock photographer for quite a few years. And so I'll just leave it at this. You have a fantastic conversation about Prussian blue.
Yeah, we did.
I loved it.
An important color in Meghann's arsenal.
Oh, and in Meghann's work, which is very collaborative with the environment. So, I mean, it was really good. Seriously, it was really good. And also, Meghann is not only the first process artist, but maybe the largest large-scale work artist that we've had on. And between that and, of course, your love of books and talking about, translating that large work to books was a really great part of the conversation as well.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And how she did, well, I won't get into it because you'll hear her talk about it, but it is really fascinating. And she also talks about failure and how she channels that. And you said something to me before we started recording that's more eloquent than what I'm thinking. But what did you say?
It was the idea of failure and rejection and how that's fuel and evidence for knowing that you're on this new direction and that you're out there and you're doing it.
In a new direction.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah. It was really good.
Well, it's a really good conversation, and I'm sure we have process artists who listen, and so this one's for you and for everyone else, because of course Meghann is just extremely rigorous artist, and her process is fascinating.
Yeah.
And
I
really
thought it was
admirable.
energizing, the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's get to it. If you don't mind, Michael, please take it away.
Absolutely. While we're still healthy, we are going to get this episode up. So here is your conversation with Meghann Riepenhoff.
Meghann Riepenhoff, welcome to the PhotoWork podcast. It's great to have you on. We've been trying to nail you down. Sounds a little violent, but trying to nail down a time with you. Meghann Riepenhoff is actually Jesus. All right. See, that already went sideways.
Love it. But the edit is perfect. Yeah.
It's not like the audience doesn't know about my horrible jokes. Been trying to get you on the show for a while, so happy to be talking with you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Someone who's known of your work for so long, just loving it for so long. So yeah, thank you. So as we do, we start every show with the artist's origins and journey. So if you don't mind, please tell us all about yourself.
Sure. So I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and you will hear me say things like y'all, and you'll hear my Southern accent come out occasionally. I was always interested in art. There was never a time in life that art wasn't probably my favorite thing to engage in. As a child, I was really interested in drawing and ballet, and those two things held my focus throughout adolescence. And I went into college at the University of Georgia thinking that I would study drawing, and my parents were totally freaked out by that and encouraged me to have a double major. So I was pursuing a drawing and English degree simultaneously. I had taken one photography class in high school. It was a black and white course, and I had this really cool teacher named Peggy Harris, who I remember so well. And I thought that photography was really enthralling. I was excited by it, but I just kept returning to drawing. So it kind of felt like a little introduction, but it didn't grab me yet. And then at the University of Georgia, I took a course from actually Mark Steinmetz, and I remember I was making these like really, really bad black and white photographs, and I had a critique with him, and he said, you know, these pictures look like bad commercial photography. They look like an unskilled, and he was right. And that's the thing, is he was so right. And he delivered it skillfully. It's not like he came down with like a brutal comment in defense of Mark. But the critique was exactly what I needed to hear. And it kind of cleared aside my notions of how I thought photographs should look. It just it just wiped away the expectations of trying to look like images that I was seeing in magazines. And next thing I knew, I was at my advisor's office saying, I think I want to switch from drawing to photography. And I remember so well, the advisor at UGA said, oh, we're going to lose another one to the basement because that's where the dark rooms are. And he was right. I mean, I went down there and I spent the next 3 years, you know, late nights, weekends in the darkroom. And so my first love and obsession was with black and white photography, but we had a color processor there. And the color course that I took just totally changed everything in my artistic direction for me. I loved the way specifically Fuji products could reproduce blues and greens. I mean, do you remember like early Fuji film and paper? Yeah, those saturated tones in that blue and green spectrum just like roped me in. And I have an uncle who had been in advertising, and I remember he saw me shooting with Kodak, and he was like, I need you to try Fuji and just learn the difference. So I learned I could like navigate reds and oranges with Kodak and like blues and greens with Fuji. And
wow, that's great.
Right?
That's awesome.
So cool that he showed me that. So I spent the rest of my college career pretty much fixated on large and medium format color photography. Simultaneously, I was in the process of trying to move to the West Coast. And I took off for Humboldt State University as an early 20-something and did my last year of college out in the Redwoods. And
wow.
Yeah, it was an abrupt change. But honestly, the first time I went to that landscape, I knew I was going to move there.
Yeah, it's dramatic. And
those trees, I mean, those trees are like...
No. California. It's an amazing place.
Yeah, and like thousands of years.
Bringing people there.
Exactly. Yeah, you know, thousands of years in these redwoods, and you can witness that kind of large time scale in the landscape there. So
without a doubt. Yep.
Once I got to California, I stayed on the West Coast, and a little cutback to my early childhood. When I was 9, my now still best friend, and I made a pact that when we were older, we would move to San Francisco together. And so when I was applying to graduate school, I applied to SFAI, San Francisco Art Institute, rest in peace. And turned out she got a job interview the same weekend I had an interview at SFAI, and we met up there, and we just never looked back. We just stayed.
That's fantastic. That is so fantastic.
Yeah. We got an apartment in Oakland, and I went to SFAI and again, just like hung out with the color processor all the time. And grad school was a fantastic time for me. I think I made some of the worst work of my life, which is probably what grad school is for. And wound up going to a residency at the Banff Center for the Arts in Canada a couple years after grad school.
You must have had great professors at SFAI.
Oh my gosh, great professors. Linda Connor, Hank Wessel, I had Reagan Louie, Doug Hall, Tony Labatt, just a whole slew of John Priola. Oh, Paul Koss, like all these guys in the new genres department. So I went to the Banff Center, and I was still making sort of 4x5 and 6x7 pictures of place, really, pictures of light in place, and a lot of portraiture still. And I just had this urge, like, I need to flip my practice upside down. I don't know where it's going, but it can't stay here. And I started making really, really bad sculptures. I mean, like, I was going to the dollar store and getting balloons and inflating them and tying them to strings and pretending like they were planets and doing these performances of like teaching a planet to orbit and stuff, and like making constellations with the freckles on my body. And I came to a moment where I was like, I got to get all this stuff out of my studio. It's like clogging up the vibe in here. And I took it all down to my dark room. And like next thing I knew, I was making photograms with those objects. And it totally...
The beginning, yeah.
Yep, that's the beginning. That's the origin story.
God, that's amazing.
Yeah. You know, it's something that carries through for me with my practice today, and how I got to this work is how important the mistakes are, the things that we view as the failures. Those are absolutely, for me, the fuel and the evidence of when I'm pushing myself into a new and interesting place in the studio.
I always just think of, the audience, just, there's certain things I repeat over and over again, and I just imagine the listeners groaning when I do it, and I'm about to do it again. But I just think of those things as like sketching.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not opposed to the word failure, by the way. I think failing is important. It's part of life. It's fine. I used to be a filmmaker, and the first film I ever made, I literally couldn't tell you what it's about.
Yeah.
And I wrote it. Okay, I didn't just direct. I actually wrote and directed it, and I don't know what it's about. So, that was a fail. But it's also, it is a sketch, like, because it gets you to the next thing, right? So
they're essential.
I think all of these things are so important. Yeah.
I remember some teacher in my graduate program, and I forget who it was right now, but they said that in terms of so there's the work, there's the art making, and then there's the career, trying to get the work out there. And their recommendation for pursuing getting the work seen was that you should have like 100 rejection letters by the end of every year So you might have like one successful letter by the end of the year. And that was both terrifying and kind of exhilarating because it sort of lets you know that the focus needs to stay on the artwork and the rest of it is just maybe coming along and maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, look, I could take this conversation down a sort of more nuts and bolts direction. I will not, but I will just quickly say, as an art dealer, same goes for me and every art dealer, right? It's like, it's very hard to sell art and you can't think about all those no's. You just move on. You just, we're sort of just doing the same thing. So let's tell folks, what you're doing. So how do you describe the type of artist that you are? Because you're not a photographer in the traditional sense. So how do you've met someone at a party and they ask you, what do you do? What do you say to that?
So I typically respond by saying, I'm an artist who works collaboratively with the environment. And then inevitably the person at the party goes, what does that mean? And I go, I work with antiquated photographic processes and I work with precipitation or standing water on the surface of the planet and ice. And I work with the elements in the environment that leave direct impact into the photographic materials. So that can feel a little bit opaque. And then I oftentimes tell people, have you seen those sun print kits that like 5-year-olds use? And typically people have seen those in a museum store or something. And then I unpack that and I say, I had never seen anybody work with that material in the ways that I work with it. And I was really influenced by Anna Atkins being such a badass, a woman at her time working in the field. Granted, she was probably would have identified as an amateur botanist and not an artist, but nonetheless, she made very interesting art using cyanotype and materials that she collected from the shoreline. And so Atkins was taking these specimen and making beautiful photograms with them. And I wanted to nod to her. And so I decided to take the process to the shoreline and have the shoreline be both the subject matter and the process and the way that I was working with the materials. So it's all rooted in this history of this woman from the 1840s who just quite literally changed scientific illustration and changed the way we thought about photography and made the first photo book.
So how exactly do you work?
Yeah, so I coat paper in my studio, and then typically it goes into like garbage bags and boxes and layers of kind of DIY light safe materials. And then I go out to a selected landscape. And at that point, I begin submerging the paper in waves or engaging it in rain or freezing weather. And so there's a very tactile experience where the paper is actually touching the things that are imaging on it, touching the waves, touching the sand. The wind is blowing things across it. And then the paper goes through this engagement with my mediation for anywhere from, I would say the shortest exposure I could get away with is 30 minutes. And oftentimes it's more like days. And so I'm out there moving the paper or adjusting it or absorbing a puddle that I know will never dry and sort of creating situations where the paper can also maintain structural integrity. Because you can imagine like a big challenge is just how to keep the damn paper together once it's saturated. And then there's the sometimes epic feat of just trying to get the paper back into my studio. So I have a van with racks in the back that I will pull the paper out of the landscape and put it on those racks, or I use boards to support the paper, bringing it back in, and then it goes through a drying and curing process.
Yeah, just for folks who haven't seen your work, not all, but many of your pieces are incredibly large.
Yes.
So when people, this sort of description of wrestling with the paper, we're not talking about a 8x10, 1620, 2024, 34. I mean, you're often working with really large sheets of paper.
That's right. A typical size is like 42 by 88, 42 by 60. But I think of those as like the small to medium works, which always cracks my galleries up. For the record, 88 inches long is not small. But yeah, the biggest pieces are like 12 feet tall, 20 feet wide. And so, you can imagine taking paper like that out into the wilds. You're engaging with things you don't anticipate. A big gust of wind comes and then the next, say, 10 minutes are spent like collecting the paper and assessing where it tore. And is it an interesting tear, or is it a tear that just rendered the piece kind of compositionally mute, let's say? And
just to sort of further this image of you now as a sort of superhero, you also have made pieces that are, I don't know if you've done ones bigger than this, but I know you've made pieces with individual pieces of paper that number into the 60s that then become one piece.
That's right.
That you've made at one time, just to be really clear. You're not like going out different times and making these prints. You've been wrestling with 60-something pieces of coated photographic paper in the elements at once, which is nuts.
It's nuts. Yeah.
The scientific term, nuts.
So I described that early on. The language that I found that most aptly described that experience is chaos with a dash of control. Like, that's how it feels when I do it. And interestingly, my partner told me that that's what it's like to live with me. So that might just be my vibe.
All right. It's all coming together now. Right. I get it.
But it does take really an appreciation for surrender and a willingness to acknowledge that what is to come is not within my control.
Could you do work? Could you be happy making work that wasn't as physical, or is this physicality essential to your happiness with the process?
Younger artist Meghann would have said that it wasn't essential, but I mean, the last 15, 20 years of my practice indicate physicality is important. I did a series of photograms where I spoke and sang and otherwise created breath into sand that was on photographic paper in a color darkroom. And my breath moved the sand into formations. And then I exposed that. All the photograms I made that from my series like Instar and Dark Matter, some of this older work of mine, they required a heavy physical engagement. I was literally bringing backpacks full of kind of dollar store detritus into the darkroom and kind of blind sculpting while the exposure was happening. And so by the time I got to the Headland Center for the Arts, which is just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, I didn't have access to the darkroom there in the same way. But what carried through from my practice was physicality and manipulating photographic materials to try to see images that I hadn't seen before. And that's when I wound up down on the beach with this Anna Atkins inspiration. I was thinking about physicality also in terms of what it moves through me while I'm making. So, I'm excited when I'm on the beach. I'm anxious. I'm hopeful. I'm trying to make interesting pictures, but also, as we've discussed, things are potentially quite chaotic and really out of control. And I think that there is a way that the physical movement gives some sort of outlet for all of the emotions and sort of psychical states that come in that vulnerable space of making art.
Yeah, I've seen photographs of you making work, and it's you could be a scientist, you could be a Greenpeace activist, I mean, there's something so, in the pictures I've seen, you're often being pummeled by waves, storms. And I mean, it doesn't look like, when you think about photographs of photographers. So, maybe they're going to do a lecture and the picture that's used for the publicity for the lecture is a shot of them out in the field, whatever. And it's, it's like them next to a tripod and everything's very peaceful, whatever. And, the pictures of you look like a crazy scientist with no boundaries, or, someone who's sort of risking, a lot. And so it just seems, and I'm projecting here because I'm someone who loves the elements, but just seems like there must be something addictive to some extent in the adrenaline of that experience. And then you don't just have the experience that you have, a memory of, you actually come back with some spectacular piece of artwork. So I
sometimes
can imagine that. Sometimes, right. No, and look, I am sure there's a lot of misses. And let me just sort of segue actually to a question I have after my little speech. I'm going to quote you here. When I first started making this work, I went to conservators and cyanotype experts to ask them what we might see in 100 years. The answer is, we don't fully know. I'm really excited by this uncertainty because, much like life itself, change occurs in ways we cannot predict. And I think that was from an interview you did that was on Strange Fire Collective's website. And you went on to say, I was also thinking about how Stephen Shore defines an image as an object that has its own life in the world, to be saved in a shoebox or in a museum. At the crux of that idea is the understanding that photographs change according to context, viewership, time, etc. I wanted to make work that changes too, that pushes back against this idea of the static image. I also wanted to push back against the idea of the archival image, something that seems to imply that photography is exempt from the very nature of life itself, which is change and ultimately death. People often ask me what the work's final state is after I've told them that it changes. The final state is change. So the first question I have is, how much are these photographs that you make going to change? I mean, are they going to change at the rate that gelatin silver prints change, or at the rate that old sea prints have changed, or something totally different? Or do you have no idea? And how do you think about that beyond what I just read?
Yeah. So this work came at a time when I was studying impermanence, and I was thinking about a resistance to change that I think is a very natural state for humans to experience. And I was thinking about the difficulty of impermanence, right? Losing people, things changing in uncomfortable ways, but also impermanence can be a massive relief. Sometimes change brings about just what you needed. And sometimes when you're in difficulty, impermanence can be like the best gift you could have possibly asked for, because the thing that has been so difficult will eventually shift. It may not go away, but it is inevitable that things will shift and change. And simultaneously, as I was sort of in this investigation, there were really fascinating programs going on at like SF MoMA and other museums around the country, and they were trying to deal with the question of what's happening with sea prints. And different artists were approaching the color shifts that they were seeing in their prints in different ways. So some artists were requiring that the museum pull the original print out of the collection, destroy it, and then they would replace it with an inkjet print. Others were supplementing side by side. So here's the original print, here's an inkjet. And others were saying, no, the print is the thing. The print is the object. And come what may, this is the thing that I made. And I was fascinated by these conversations, and I was getting to listen in to what conservators and curators were thinking about them. And I just found that a lot of conversations were based around like archival properties. And to me, that positioned the work in such a human time frame. And I wanted to think about work in the context of geologic time, and also to think about our existence in the context of geologic time, and how we're just like a fraction of a moment in this huge time scale. So the pictures themselves that I started making in response to this idea of impermanence, they are always collaborating with their environment. So when the question is put to me, like, what will they look like in 5 years or 10 years, or how will they change? The answer is, it depends on the conditions in which they're living. So for example, a huge grid that I have in the collection at SF MoMA, they are storing that in cold storage. It's in a specific pH situation. Their interest is in preserving the work as close to the state that it was in at the time that they acquired it. In contrast to that, I've had collectors who say, what gets me about this work, what drew me in, is the change. And I'm going to put this thing in a south-facing window with no glazing, and I'm going to watch it just shift and change over the years. So there's a huge range of what we can expect to see.
Those are collectors who have a lot of money.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
I just spent $100,000 on a Meghann Riepenhoff, and I'm going to sit here and watch it disappear.
Watch it change. So the news from conservators is that it won't disappear. The chemistry is creating a Prussian blue pigment, which is sensitive to UV light. And I learned from Mike Ware, who made the new cyanotype formula, that Prussian blue pigment, even when it's fully fixed and washed, which all happens in one step with cyanotype, it still has the capacity to lighten and darken over time, and it vacillates. And so conservators and other artists who work with cyanotype, we all kind of joke that like cyanotypes need their beauty rest. They can be out for a long time getting certain amounts of UV light, and what starts to happen is the Prussian blue pigment starts to reduce to Prussian white. So you see it lightening. And then when you put that print in a drawer for a month or two, the density of the blue actually replenishes. So,
wow, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
It's super fascinating.
So it's really alive.
Yeah, it's really alive, and it's really responding to the environment. And it's one of the reasons that I picked this specific material, was because I knew that could happen with it. Whereas sea prints, once it goes, it just keeps going a certain direction. But cyanotypes kind of breathe.
MoMA is painfully aware.
Yes, totally.
God, that's really, I didn't know that. That's really fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, so I sent a bunch of my pictures to this really interesting, cool guy that I met through the internet in Australia, a conservator named Bruce. And I sent him a bunch of different things. I sent him like a cyanotype properly done, a cyanotype done the way Meghann Riepenhoff does it, a silver gelatin, an inkjet, and then a print that I'm making with mushroom ink, which is new work. And I asked him to test their relative light fastness. And he was floored. He sent me back a chart for the prints done my way. And he was like, do you know that your prints can lighten and darken? And I was like, yeah, that's one of my favorite things about them.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And so, the question of control, which is so live in my work, like, what am I controlling? What is the environment controlling? Where do those edges bump up against each other? That continues in whoever's hands are holding the cyanotype. Like, it doesn't stop with me.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a really beautiful concept. Now that I've got you warmed up, let me ask a tough question.
I'm here for it.
Okay. I knew you would be. How do you reconcile? I mean, look, this is a question that, I could ask a lot of artists. It's, how do you reconcile the beauty of your images? Your images are really breathtakingly beautiful.
Thank you.
With the subject matter that is, or the context that's often about environmental destruction. And please, in answering that, feel free to talk a little bit about some projects where that is specific and clear, whether it's the, Great Salt Lake or, Kodak Superfund sites or whatever.
Yeah, so one of my hopes with my work, and I tread lightly when I say this because I'm not interested in dictating what the audience experience should be, but
right.
A hope that I have is that the work is a catalyst for connection. The physicality, the literal specks of sand, tears and punctures that occur from rowdy waves, all of these ways that the environment quite literally imprints into the work. I hope that that is a way for a viewer to initiate some sort of connection with the landscape, with water, with the environment around them. So the beauty of it is kind of like a call to look more closely and more slowly. It's like an entree, this exists in this space. And also, to talk about Kodak, this came from a situation that's really loaded. And we can think about environmental impact in a lot of ways, but certainly one important way is that we're all engaged with systems nearly involuntarily that cause detrimental impact on our environment. Photography is super interesting. It has been used to preserve huge swaths of land in our country and across the world. So in that way, it's been a tool for preserving the environment. And also, Kodak made this big hell of a mess in the Northeast with 4 Superfund sites between New York and New Jersey. So when I speak about our relationship to the environment, I am always trying to put forth the idea of how complicated it is. It's not just that we're damaging it. It's not just that we love it and need it and are it, quite literally. I think about how Rebecca Solnit talks about hope as an action that you're constantly choosing to hope. You're constantly choosing to, to be engaged with hope. And I think about the beauty in my work in that way. I hope it can call people in to think about these bigger ideas, but in a way where it's approachable because they have this beautiful thing that introduces the complicated concepts to them.
And just to be clear to the audience, a lot of your work is made specifically in areas that are compromised.
Yeah, a really
under
interesting...
threat, under siege.
That's right. A really interesting place to work. One of my favorite places to work is the Great Salt Lake. And I mean, it's been in the news recently. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have heard about the devastating risks that we're facing as the water levels drop, that it's going to literally create poisonous clouds. And, one fascinating thing about the Great Salt Lake is humans divided it into 2 discrete bodies of water with a railroad causeway. And what wound up happening with that division is different bacteria grew on each side of that. So we kind of turned one lake into 2 lakes. And the first time I printed there, it was also experiencing at the time record low levels, which have since been obliterated by new record lows. But also a couple months after I first printed there was a plan that they were going to cut holes in the causeway to let the water reconnect, the 2 different discrete waters reconnect. And I just kept thinking, we as humans do these kind of massive environmental interventions with unknown consequences. And we just move forward and maintain hope that it's the right decision.
Yeah. So, obviously what we were just talking about also really connects with your new work, Ice, because we're also dealing with the loss of the glaciers and the ice caps melting. And so, once again, you're immersed in a lot of ways, but immersed in that sort of preoccupation with environmental destruction and loss. And it's really an extraordinary body of work. I want to congratulate you, number one, and also ask you a bit about the book. And I don't know if it's sold out yet. If it's not, it should be. But if it's not, people should really, it feels very special. It's just a spectacular object. Sometimes I'm loath to talk too much about something that our listeners don't have and they're not holding like I am in front of them. But this book is so beautiful, and people can at least find it online and connect a little bit with what we're going to talk about here a bit. But tell me about how you came up with this design. You did this with Radius Books and with your gallery, Yossi Milo, but it feels really special. So
thank you. Yeah, it's not sold out. So it is available online.
Buy the book, people.
Yeah. Thank you. So,
well, and let me ask you one. Sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
Let me ask you one last question to tackle. When you tell me about sort of the unique properties of your prints, and then how that translates to book form, and how do you feel about that translation?
Cool. That's definitely part of the conversation around the book. So I'm glad you asked that. So first of all, thank you for your support of the book. I'm happy with it, and I'm so happy it's finally out there in the world. I think
it's mesmerizing.
Thank you. I think anyone who made a book during peak pandemic can attest that it was a challenge.
Yeah.
But
this was printed in Italy.
That's right. Yeah. And at one point, they ran out of paper, and then they ran out of cardboard boxes to ship books, right? So everyone was in this boat together.
Supply chain.
But my prints, as we talked about earlier, are oftentimes quite large, and photographing them and getting them to fit in a book scale can be very difficult. It can be challenging to make them feel like they feel when you've reduced them to sort of like an 8x10 reproduction. And with the Littoral Drift and with the Ecotone works that were in my first monograph with Radius and Yossi, I found that I could satisfactorily reproduce the images, and that they still had the sensibilities of the prints. I never expect that a book page is going to exactly look like an image, but it should feel like an image. And we were able to do that. And we did some things like we used gatefolds so an image could get quite large, and we showed details, right? So if you could understand, like, this one little corner of this print has all of this going on. And that was very satisfying. With the ice work, they are so much about the details. And the more that I tried to print them at book scale, the less I felt convinced that that was the right route. And I always photograph my pieces as they're exposing out in the landscape. I'm really interested in the ways that they go through different palette shifts, and the way that salt forms, and all of the things that happen. And so I had a slew of photographs of prints occurring in their earliest exposures. And then I also always photograph details of my prints. And it occurred to me that I could take these images that I had been making in the icework and think of them as kind of a raw material for the book pages. And so we opted to not include a single full image in the whole book. It is a series of details of pictures from the ice series. And some of them, I photographed like the first hour that the piece was out in the environment, and it doesn't look anything like that anymore. And then others are details of the pieces once they are more stable and more static and living in the studio. But it felt like I wanted the book to be a piece of art in its own right, and of course something that's much more accessible for most people, as contrasted to trying to buy prints. And I also wanted the pages to open flat so that you could actually see what was going on in the gutter. And when David Chicky and I were talking about design, I was going back and forth between hardcover and softcover. And we just kind of were like, well, we can do both. Actually, the back can be hardcover and the front can be softcover. And it can open kind of like the feeling of a portfolio. So there's this kind of like intimacy and like reveal, the way you kind of open up an artist's portfolio and flip through their prints carefully.
I love this description, and it's quite large. I haven't measured it, so I don't know the actual trim size, but it's probably like 12 by 18 or something like that?
I think I'm staring at a copy in front of me. I think it's around 11 by 50, 12 by 15, I think.
Yeah, so it's a big book. I love that. I love everything you just said. It just totally tracks with the way I interact with it. It's a book you do just put down in front of you because it does lay flat, and you can really fall in. I mean, it's so mesmerizing, and everything about it is so seductive. The paper is really, really feels wonderful, and the colors in the reproductions are just exquisite, and it's not full bleed. I just want to say thank God, because I don't like full bleed. I'm really sorry, people, but I don't. But it's almost full bleed. But there's just enough white to let each image. What I don't like about full bleed is if it's on my coffee table, then there's all of a sudden my coffee table and the picture are becoming one. So just enough white space gives me that sort of, it's the way I see, it's the way I absorb information.
Yeah,
so
I mean, it's quite literally a frame,
anyway.
Right? It's just a small frame.
Right, it's a frame, but it gives you that break. And anyway, I really love the design. David is just fantastic,
Yeah.
I work with Barbara Bosworth, represent Barbara,
yeah.
and so he's done such an amazing job with Barbara's books.
Oh yeah, they make beautiful books, and you mentioned the pages, that the paper feels good, and one of the things that excited me about the way the ink went down on this paper is in some of the darker areas, you start to feel a slight tactility. If you run your hand over the print, there's kind of this slight grit that occurs. And I love that idea of incorporating something tactile into a primarily visual experience. And with the ice work, I wanted the cover to be like all white, but we decided to stamp in some shapes that I pulled from one of the ice prints. So they're actually like blind embossed into the cover and the slipcase. And my hope was that when somebody picks up that book, their first experience of it will actually be a physical touch sensation. And then
that's exactly what happens.
Right? And then as you tip it, you start to see it. And that's sort of how the ice work operates too. You kind of get this overall impression of a print in front of you. And then as you move your body toward it or away from it or different light hits it, these pretty beautiful details start to reveal themselves. So I wanted to kind of mimic that experience, but with like a multi-sensory approach.
Well, I think you nailed it. It's great to have such clarity about what you want and really to have achieved it. I mean, often there's just so many hurdles, and I'm sure there were 1,000,001 hurdles to doing that, but you did it, and it's really fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, why don't we wrap up? This is a good place to stop. I really want to congratulate you. I've known your work since you came on the scene, and I've watched your career really develop and get to where it is now. We're quite robust, so really congratulations on all your success and just on continuing to make such really beautiful work and very moving work. So
thank you. And I also just want to shout out to all of my collaborators, from the water to my incredible galleries and the people that support me at institutions. It's fascinating, and I'm just living a dream life getting to make art all the time.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a nightmare being an artist, and sometimes you get the dream.
That's right.
But so that's nice of you to do that. I know you work with a lot of really wonderful people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Meghann. Well, be well.
You
and
too.
Thanks again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I hope to meet you in person.
For sure.
Okay.
Okay. Take care.
Bye. Well, that was so fun. Oh my gosh, that was so fun. Oh, hilarious. The mic's still going. Well, that was super fun, y'all.
PhotoWork with Sasha Wolf is produced by me, Michael Chauvin-Dalton of Real Photo Show. The associate producer is Taylor Selsback, and the executive producer is Sasha Wolf. Our theme music is by J. Walter Hawks. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe and rate us with all the stars available on your listening platform.